Hi, welcome everybody to this narrated uh, version of the keynote presentation that we would have lectured on and discussed last week. I'm sorry it's taken so long to get this to you. Well, first of all, I'm sorry about the fiasco that was Monday. Those of you that haven't heard the rumors or haven't heard what happened, the short of it is I was a victim of a scam, and I spent a very long portion of the day at the Hawaiian police station trying to get someone to give a crap. And the National Police were thoroughly convinced that I was a victim of violations of several statutes, and Hawaiian took a different view. So finally I got some help, but it took most of the day. So sorry about that. And so the solution was or is to narrate this PowerPoint or keynote presentation and present it to you so that we stay on track. The reason it's taken, I kind of hope to get it to you by midweek, by say Wednesday, Thursday. But I've actually taken probably a weirdly long amount of time going over a seemingly insignificant point, perhaps in the big picture of things, but of the many times I've taught foreign policy, I will make today a specific claim about the legacy of George Kennan, and specifically the impact of Kennan's thinking and ideas about containment as they became adopted via what we will see as a very famous and long secret document, NSC 68. Specifically, I'll make the claim that Kennan and NSC 68 had two effects. One's kind of unarguable, and the other one is the one I really spent a long time testing, is the impact of, the first claim is that Kennan and the policy document requested by Truman and then ultimately approved by Truman, known as NSC 68, National Security Council document number 68, first seriously militarized, radically militarized American foreign policy forever. And what that means is we get kind of later into the course and we get into what are called the source categories of foreign policy, we will see that American foreign policy relied more and more heavily on the military instruments available to foreign policymakers at the expense of other non-military instruments, such as economic instruments, cultural instruments, soft power instruments, those kinds of things. So that's kind of an unarguable and really uncontested proposition, but the one that I've spent a lot of time, probably a weird amount of time, confirming is something that I've claimed many times, but really haven't taken the time to do my due diligence, and that's to affirm, kind of test some alternative hypotheses regarding the impact of Kennan and NSC 68 on military spending. And I have long claimed, and I will continue to claim today, because my research in the last few days has, I think, affirmed my position, so I feel better about just making it, is that the bottom line is Kennan's ideas about containment, as formulated in NSC 68 and adopted by the Truman administration and subsequent administrations, is that it radically transformed American military spending, ramped it up, and then is really, it can be seen as perhaps the most important determinant of the regular increases in military spending on a yearly basis since the adoption of the containment policy under the Truman administration. And so it's that point, and it was a lot of statistical testing that I kind of had to do to test some rival hypotheses about what might explain what we can easily document, which is the growing, the continued growth in American military spending. So that took a much longer time to accomplish than I thought, and so that's why you're getting this a little later than I had hoped for. So, foreign policy and historical perspective. Those of you that have heard me or had me in class before have heard me ask the so what question, and those of you that haven't, let me just tell you kind of what I mean by that. because you'll hear it again. It kind of asks, what is the significance of whatever it is that we're talking about? Who cares? Why should we care about X, Y, or Z? What's the answer to the so what question? And in this case, it's why study early American foreign policy? Because most textbooks, and as you know, I don't use one, many at least, start their analysis of American foreign policy in the kind of modern era. Probably starting with, or most starting around the time of the Woodrow Wilson administration, the kind of rise of Wilson's liberal internationalism, World War I era, basically. Perhaps a little early, maybe some start with Teddy Roosevelt and some of his initiatives that kind of indicate the emergence of the modern presidency and therefore a new kind of foreign policy. But I agree with Mead that you've read, that I think there's a good deal to learn about thinking about early foreign policy. So if we take somebody like President Trump, who's kind of easy to pick on, and I'll probably take more than one opportunity to do just that. He's done a number of things that are viewed by many Americans and certainly by most of the world as unfortunate, counterproductive, bad for the world, and I think, given the interdependence that characterizes world politics today, bad for America. His tax policies, are arguably, or depending on kind of where you stand on these things, unarguably, and deficit increasing and privileging, quite a small slice of the American population, and putting a kind of fiscal balance in jeopardy that makes, among other things, the responsible pursuit of foreign policy more and more difficult. Of course, you may know that he's very quickly he adopted a tariff policy that has led to the trade war with China, and these are controversial. Consensus view among economic theorists is that his trade war that started with his tariffs is counterproductive, certainly contrary to the liberal international economic order that the U.S. has really been the principal architect of since the post-war period. We have been the hegemonic power that has designed, constructed, and guided, and largely funded in many respects, this international liberal order that's consists of institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization now, things like that. And many of Trump's policies challenge the legitimacy of that order that the U.S. itself has been the principal architect of. So he's controversial in many respects, and some of his ideas are just seen by many as lunacy. And I think that's not entirely unfair. However, I think the question has to be, well, okay, if they're called crazy, or if he's seen as crazy, and anybody that makes foreign policy or domestic policy by Twitter at 3:30 in the morning is, I think, of questionable soundness. But just how crazy are these ideas by historical comparison is a reasonable place to start. Right? And I think what we learn from a glimpse into the early, history of American foreign policy is that, first, well, okay, something like the Space Force is really just kind of crazy. Right? The Pentagon doesn't want it. It's redundant. It's remarkably expensive at a time where he's cutting taxes and thus revenue to support that sort of thing. Okay, so some ideas are just kind of, and I think his immigration policies, and we can talk about the attempted Muslim ban that was eventually modified to just a number of Muslim majority countries, but also his his immigration policy with respect to the southern border that is clearly in violation of international our the U.S. commitments to international refugee law by failing to distinguish between migrants, say economic migrants, those who are simply coming to another country or moving for better economic opportunities, and those who legitimately represent a very different legal, moral, ethical category of refugee or asylum seeker, and his policies in that regard have been reprehensible in my view. And But the reality, I think, has to be recognized that though perhaps some of his ideas are extreme and disconcerting, they are in some ways just to be seen as his particular answers to very old questions. And yes, they may be reactionary. Yes, you may not like them, or you may like them if those are your politics. But they're clearly grounded, many of them, or at least the questions that he's answering in his particular way, are grounded in historical precedent. And the reality is, as hard as this may be for some to believe, in some respects, some of his policies, particularly his trade war that he's launched with China through tariffs and those kinds of things, are pretty measured in comparison to some in particular, similar or early policies in similar domains, such as perhaps most famously, I think Mead mentions this, Thomas Jefferson's absolutely disastrous 1807 decision to embargo, meaning kind of cut off trade with Europe, all of Europe. Right? And that goes down as perhaps one of the worst foreign economic policy decisions in American history, and it led to an enormously painful economic domestic crisis. And so, when we compare the trade war that is currently going on with China with Jefferson's absolutely ridiculous and disastrous choice to embargo the entire Europe, Trump doesn't look so crazy anymore, right? So I think Mead's right that we can get a lot out of looking at early foreign policy in order to kind of put contemporary policy into some measured context, right? So what is the value of, or what are the kinds of things that we can gain from doing historical analysis? Well, the first thing, and I think the general theme of Mead's work is, his life's work actually, is that there are indeed common themes that run throughout the whole of history of American foreign policy, all the way back to the founding of the Republic. And these include things like, should the U.S., or perhaps better said, how should the U.S. use trade and tariffs, if at all, to promote the domestic economy? And early in the Republic, but even today, that's often in the business of protecting what we refer to as nascent industries, these kind of newly born industries. So today we talk about, kind of the tech industries. What kinds of measures should be taken in terms of foreign economic policy that can protect newborn industries from international competition so that they can grow, establish themselves, and become a part of the diversified American economy? So, should the U.S. use trade and tariffs to do that sort of thing? Is one of the oldest questions in American foreign policy. Likewise, of course, obviously, since most of you came of age in the era of the Bush presidency, the second Bush presidency, and a disastrous war in Iraq, that was ex post facto justified with humanitarian reasons, but always actually, even prior to the war, represented as part of a design to promote democracy and human rights throughout the region by starting with Iraq, kind of a domino effect. So again, one of the oldest questions in American foreign policy: should the U.S. Do that? Should we make the effort? Should we expend the resources and the political will to promote democracy and human rights within our foreign policy? Or should we not? Should we not make judgments about the what we might say today is the internal affairs of sovereign states? And that's a really hotly contested issue even today, and clearly Trump has taken a position that that's not something we should care anything about. So he's perfectly well. It's just kind of weird, I think, the way he has cozied up and seems to have far friendlier relationships with autocratic President of Russia Putin, North Korea. Just kind of odd that he seems to be much closer with the President of the Philippines, for example, Duterte, that is also a autocratic, murderous autocrat, rather than our very close and traditional allies like Germany, well, Western Europe in general, and Canada to the north, right? So he's clearly taken a position that none of that stuff should be a part of American foreign policy, and as a result, he's made some interesting choices about who he cozies up with and who he does not. There is, however, this long kind of history or long principle or tradition that the U.S. should, in fact, be doing just that, and it dates back even prior to the founding of the republic. That there was something quite special going on in the New World, and that we were kind of divinely endowed with a mission to act as this shining city on the hill, and by our example, and then subsequently by our resources, spread the good message, spread the good news of democracy and human rights and individual integrity and those kinds of things. So, old question. What kind of world order can we reasonably expect? Now, this is something we'll come back to, and of course, it's kind of the general thrust of the whole course on the world order since 1500 that we teach. Is it reasonable that we can maintain a relatively peaceful, well-ordered international environment through the judicious and rational and well-thought-out application of both coercion and suasion, moral suasion? Can we expect that the world can progress to or progress from the kind of realist pessimism of a Hobbesian state of nature, of war of all against all, in which we must ultimately rely only on ourselves, that self-help dictum of realism? Or can we expect that the international order can grow, mature, increasingly come to constitute what we will at some point refer to as international society rather than merely an international system? These are very old questions, and we can learn something about how the U.S. has approached the notion of world order over time. Another big issue today and in the past is, and certainly related to the idea of world order, is how much faith should we have in international law? International law is a curious animal, and it's why it's an interesting area to study. One person famously said, yes, it's international, but is it law? Meaning, because international law lacks all of or many of the elements that we associate with a legal regime at a domestic level, institutions that pass law like legislatures, and institutions that implement the laws like executives, and institutions that adjudicate disputes in the law or interpret the law, judiciaries, none of that really exists at the international level. Certainly not to the degree or in the shape and form that one finds in domestic political systems. And so given the absence of all those things, how much faith should we have in international law? There are those who have traditionally said that's not something we should put any stock in. And there are those who have always said, no, the promotion of international law is absolutely central to, trying to achieve a world order that is something better than Hobbes's state of nature or law of the jungle. And interestingly, despite the absence of those institutions or the absence of those many elements of what we would recognize as essential to domestic regimes of law, famously Henkin noted, most states follow most of the principles of international law most of the time, including the most powerful states like the U.S. So despite the weirdness about international law, it seems to be far more effective, far more influential, far more determinative of state behavior, including the behavior of the most powerful state in the system, the U.S., than one can really explain through traditional realist methods. So, an old question indeed. Should the U.S. build up its military defenses? Perhaps should it is less of a question today for Americans. There seems to be, almost near consensus that continuing to build up its military preparedness is a question with only one answer: yes. But that wasn't always the case, and it's a fairly recent consensus, as we'll see. But even if there's a consensus about yes, we should, there are great differences of opinion about how we should do that and to what degree. And as Mead points out, this is as old of a question as we can find in American foreign policy. Where should we put our defenses? And so in the early republic, it was, questions about, where do we build our fortifications against naval attack? And is it reasonable to expect that we can defend against naval attacks given the enormity of our coastal borders? So old questions indeed. Perhaps there is consensus now, for better or for ill, among Americans that ever increasing military preparedness is appropriate. Questions about what form that should take, and to what degree are questions that linger, and we'll have something very specific to say about that today. Should we focus, on ourselves? So there are those, and Trump is kind of in this boat, right? He's, not just seemingly disinterested in engaging or leading the international order that the U.S. as the hegemonic power has constructed in the post-World War II era, but he's quite hostile to it, and so he's in many respects an inward-looking isolationist kind of leader. And for those who think that for whatever shortcomings, and it has many, the liberal international order is far preferable to the chaos that comes when orders collapse. And so there are, very present debates about this, but, as we've seen, if you've done the reading, that it hasn't been very long that the U.S. has embraced the role of leader of the world. Rather, it for a very long time rejected that idea. So the bottom line here is, I think Mead's point is right, or is certainly appropriate, that there's a great deal we can learn by taking this historical view. Knowledge of how these questions have been answered in the past can help us grapple with them in their form that they come in today. Okay, so so we're talking about at first the early American empire, and I think it's reasonable to say that the U.S. or America has been engaged in empire building from its earliest moments, right? But I think it's also fair to say it's kind of a uniquely American empire. There was, I think it's critically important to understand, an initial golden rule that governed American foreign policy for a very long time. And we can see this golden rule articulated by the first president of the United States in George Washington's farewell address. And this is one of two farewell addresses we're going to consider today. Obviously, we don't have any video for this one, but we do for the next one. But in Washington's farewell address, when he was stepping down from the office that he could have kept for as long as he wanted, and he kind of established a very important principle there of not staying in power as long as he wanted. But in his farewell address, he had this to say, that the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is extending in our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. And you'll see there, commercial relations and political connections bolded or highlighted, because it's important to distinguish between those two things, because the principle that is getting articulated here and that will become recognized as essentially the American grand strategy that lasts until, well, really until the end of World War II, in a permanent way, has often been misunderstood. He goes on to say in his address that it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Okay, so note that permanent alliances. That doesn't mean that we won't engage. And notice in the first quotation, he's talking about, we are in the business of extending our commercial relations. So this principle that he's articulating is not about cutting ourselves off from the world, but rather engaging in the world in a very limited, focused kind of way. Okay? And however, even in those commercial relations, even in our commercial policy, he says, should hold an equal and impartial hand, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting the natural course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing. Okay, so what's he saying here, right? That obviously commercial policy should be at the center of American foreign policy. As Meade makes clear, the welfare of the American people has, from the earliest moments of even in the colonial period, but certainly from the earliest moments of the Republic, the health and welfare of American society, economic welfare, has been intimately connected to the success of American foreign policy. And for Washington, he's warning, or he's calling on the American people and the successor to his administration to remember that we are not, or should not be, in the business of establishing these kind of partial bilateral relationships at the expense of others. We should try to remain in our commercial foreign policy, or in our commercial dealings with the world, as open, even-handed, and impartial as possible, so as to maximize the economic opportunities that will benefit the American people. And also, of course, in not acting partially, and not establishing, bilateral preferential trade agreements with the UK at the expense of France, for example, or vice versa, then we lower the probability that we entangle ourselves in disputes between France and the UK, for example, and then get ourselves involved in conflicts that we have no business being involved in. Particularly, I think the point is important to make when, this is a fledgling republic, right? This is not a military power of any size, and so there's a good deal of just prudence about this principle that's being articulated. The third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, also articulated this initial golden rule in his inaugural address. So that was Washington on his way out, Jefferson on his way in, has very, very similar things to say. And the most famous part of his inaugural address is simply this section, or this comment that I've chosen here: that peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. So, again, the principle being articulated here is not that we are going to not engage with the world. That would be stupid. No nation can truly sustain itself economically just relying on its own resources. So every nation or every state in the world must, in fact, engage in trade relationships, commercial relationships, those kinds of things. But he again is echoing or channeling Washington here by saying, in our effort at promoting peace, commerce, and honest friendship, we engage not in these entangling alliances, meaning, in modern parlance, we should avoid the kinds of bilateral treaties, security agreements, security arrangements, security treaties that kind of promise ourselves to come to the defense of another in case they get attacked. Stay away from that kind of entanglement. Right? So engage in commerce and open, honest friendship relationships, but do as little, if any at all, of these permanent entangling alliances. So what's the principle here that Washington and Jefferson are articulating, and that really does represent what will become reasonably seen as American grand strategy for a very, very long time? Well, you may know the concept of isolationism, but that's really what they're talking about. But what I have hopefully made clear here is isolationism is not synonymous, or it does not in any way mean cutting ourselves off from the world in terms of just relationships in general. In fact, isolationism was about maximizing commercial relations, but minimizing political engagements, diplomatic engagements. So we didn't build embassies, for example, in most countries until very, very late in the American Republic's history. So isolationism is the order of the day, and it will last, as I've noted, for a very, very long time. So the early empire, again, the essential principle is isolationism. Never tie up the country in alliances, especially with stronger European powers, because they could clearly dictate the terms of those alliances, and that's kind of just irrational. So there's a real rational basis for isolationism. We are not, as this fledgling republic, in a position of strength to engage in political relationships. So the best thing to do, the consensus was to not do that kind of political engagement and avoid those entangling alliances. So avoid, and there's quite a nasty sort of vision of European affairs and European politics at the time. With some, with some reason. The period of the 16th and 17th century, well, even before that, but was ceaseless warfare. Not until kind of after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars come to an end, does Europe really take seriously the business of trying to build a more peaceful European environment with what's called the Congress of Vienna system. And that actually, it's conservative, it's pro-monarchical and all that kind of stuff, but it did a pretty good job of keeping the peace for about 100 years. But nevertheless, they were still, all of them much more powerful bigger navies, much more experience in warfare. So the smart thing to do is just not get involved in relationships with European countries that could lead to us being dragged into the seemingly endless conflicts that plagued the European continent for so long. Because doing so could threaten the very existence of our new state. So, foreign policy was important to the early U.S., is Mead's point, but it was characterized by this consistent threat of resistance to entanglement. Okay? So, as Mead says again and again, the health, welfare of American society has been intimately connected to successful commercial foreign policy, or to foreign policy in general, but so as I noted, when Jefferson chose to embargo all of, just cut off trade with all of Europe, Americans suffered greatly. So bad foreign policy, from the very earliest days, has been demonstrated to have deleterious effects on the health and welfare of American people. So nothing new about that, right? Nothing new about the debates about Trump's foreign policy and the impact on the American economy, and reading The Economist and those kinds of sources over the last 5-6 weeks. There appears to be a growing consensus that a recession in the United States is more than increasingly likely. There's a growing kind of almost consensus that that recession is now perhaps unavoidable, largely due to Trump's approach to the combination of tax cuts and revenue losses and the tariffs and the trade wars that he started. So, as was true at the beginning of the Republic, the health and welfare of the American people is heavily influenced, heavily dependent on. So entanglement, again, just kind of driving that point home, means permanent strategic alliances, trade pacts that favor one state over another. That's the thing that we're to avoid. Right? So what I'm going to talk about now is often seen by students, or kind of new students of foreign policy, as seemingly contradictions to the principle of isolationism, and I hope I can make clear that perhaps that's reasonable, a reasonable position to take, but it's not the only one to take. What I'm going to talk about, some of the early foreign policy, important early foreign policy decisions, expansionism, things like that, are not entirely inconsistent with the isolationist grand strategy. So debatable. You're entitled to, if kind of bring these questions up. So, for example, Secretary of State James Madison, who, as Mead points out, is one of the many persons who served in the office of Secretary of State, which in the United States is like what other countries call foreign minister, the kind of head diplomat, saw very early the strategic significance of New Orleans to the United States, and it was not a part of American territory. It was, of course, it was dominated, it was controlled by France. And Napoleon seemed to have an interest in encroaching from the kind of beachhead, if you will, of New Orleans into the American Republic. So in response to that perceived strategic threat to the American Republic, we responded under the direction of Secretary of State Madison with military force. We moved our military forces into the region to counter this growing French presence, to demonstrate that we were prepared to defend our interests, defend our borders. However, all the while, at the very same time, we're kind of, exercising a little show of strength. We're engaged in very serious diplomatic initiatives or talks with that same person, Napoleon, in effort to get him to sell us that whole vast Louisiana territory that contains New Orleans. And there was a reason that he wanted to do so, because the biggest thing that Napoleon wanted to do was invade Britain. And he didn't have the money. So we were eventually able, through, I think it's fair to say, this kind of dual use, and this will come back again and again and again in our discussions of the instruments of foreign policy and a balanced foreign policy. I would say this is an instance where you have kind of a rational, well thought out balance between the demonstration of force, or a willingness to use force by putting military, by augmenting the military's presence in the region while engaging in these diplomatic initiatives. So perhaps one of the lessons here is lost on many contemporary foreign policymakers, that force, or shows of force, or demonstrations of a willingness perhaps to use force, is in no way inconsistent with, or in no way precludes, the possibility of simultaneous diplomacy. And in fact, one might argue that what some call strong foreign policy is that which is the diplomatic initiatives backed up by the presence, or the ability to demonstrate a willingness, a credible commitment to using force if necessary. And I think that's what happened there. And so as a result of this kind of joint diplomacy and coercion, if you will, it is the United States, this fledgling republic in the New World, that emerges from Europe's disastrous Napoleonic Wars with indeed the greatest prize. Right, we're the winners. The U.S. wins those wars, and by that I mean the Louisiana Purchase. When we convinced Napoleon to sell the Louisiana Territory, or Jefferson convinced Napoleon to do so, it was expensive, $11.25 million, and forgave almost $4 million in debts. Now, in today's dollars, that's almost $600 billion, right? Quite a chunk of change for a new fledgling republic. And it wasn't at all clear that Jefferson, in fact, even had the constitutional authority to do what he did. Because with the stroke of a pen, he just doubled the size or tripled the size of the country. He financed this. We didn't have, there certainly wasn't money in the budget for such an enormous purchase. So, of course, we borrowed money. And again, old issue, right? How wise is it to borrow money? To what degree is it acceptable to take on debt? Debt is perfectly legitimate. There's nothing irresponsible about taking on reasonable levels of debt. We do it as individuals. We buy houses and cars and all kinds of things by taking on debt. And there's nothing irresponsible about that if you have the resources to manage that debt. Nevertheless, this is the influence of foreign lenders in American politics became a divisive issue. And as I said, it wasn't clear that Jefferson had the authority to do so. He claimed that the treaty-making power granted to the executive office in Article 2 of the Constitution gave him that power. He exercised it, and there was nothing really Congress could do about it. So, stroke of the pen doubles the size of the country, and quite a successful early foreign policy win. But then, near disaster. So one great success is followed by near total disaster, and perhaps threatened the end of the Republic, which was the War of 1812 with Great Britain. This is a perfect example of what Washington and Jefferson and all the other, the early isolationists were talking about, because this was a case of war in Europe spilling over. And those of you that have had me for my conflict class, civil conflict, wars tend to do that. Wars tend to not be containable or not be contained, and they tend to spill over. And the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States is a classic case of European wars spilling over and involving the United States in a war it had no reason to fight, and certainly did not have the capacity to fight it well. So, Britain's war with the reason we got pulled in is the war between Britain and France, as wars did between Britain and France, include lots of naval forces, naval battles, and naval blockades. And those blockades, particularly the one by Britain, prevented U.S. trade with France. And of course, if isolation means anything, it means that's all we do is trade. So if the actions of Britain in its war with Napoleonic France impinges on our ability to trade with France, well, it's impinging on the one thing we do in foreign policy. So we, obviously and legitimately claimed it was a violation of the laws of the high seas, and it led to war. Britain took a pretty negative response to our complaints. They started impressing or basically kidnapping U.S. sailors on the high seas and forcing them into service in the British Navy, called impressment, which is another significant violation of the law of the high seas, and eventually, invaded successfully the landmass of the United States and burned the capital. I don't know if you've ever played war games, Risk or anything, but most view, if you get your capital burned, you've lost the war. They got your flag. So, the burning of Washington was a pretty devastating development for the early republic. But nevertheless, we survived it. And the war that the treaty that brought the War of 1812 to end, the Treaty of Ghent, really ended with no boundary changes whatsoever. So it was essentially a draw, but I think there were lessons learned that it was going to be much harder to defend the the vastness of the Atlantic coast, enormous Atlantic coast, from a naval power like Great Britain. One of the most important early foreign policy decisions was announced by James Monroe. It became known as the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe was, like many in the United States then and today, were committed to, at least two principles that we'll make clear here, and those two principles inform what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine is I think legitimately recognized as a critical development in early American foreign policy. Basically, the president announced in 1823 the end of European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. That was essentially the point of the Monroe Doctrine. The text of the speech of President Monroe went on to say that henceforth the United States would view European involvement and efforts to control any parts of the land masses or the seas of the Western Hemisphere as an encroachment on the American sphere of influence. So by 1823, it's fair to say that the U.S. is staking some claim to regional hegemony. And later in the course, we will read the work of the famed realist Mearsheimer, who will say that this act, the Monroe Doctrine, is just what states do when they have the power to do so. So this effort to kind of stake a claim to hemispheric hegemony is what Mearsheimer is saying that China is doing and should be expected to continue to do, precisely because that's what states do. And Mearsheimer looks to our own history, starting with the Monroe Doctrine, to say we did it, and we did it because it's in the nature of states to do that. And so we have to expect China will continue to pursue its policy of Asian regional hegemony and drive the U.S. further and further out of the Asia region. But the reality here, I think, is important. Monroe is, kind of speaking early, or kind of, we don't in any way in 1823 have the military power, the military capability to actually enforce the Monroe Doctrine. That won't happen at least until the 1890s, until well after the end of the Civil War. What the Civil War will do for the United States, besides being the most destructive and deadly conflict that the U.S. has ever faced, because of internal, it will mark for many the beginning of modern warfare, technologically developed, mass-produced, or major armaments mass-produced, armaments of mass destruction and mass production. So only after the Civil War, and really closer to the 20th century, will the U.S. actually have the military wherewithal to kind of make real the pretensions to hegemony that are enshrined in the Monroe Doctrine. But it indeed did end 300 years of European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. So quite a significant moment in American history. Continuing the empire building is the business of annexation, or part of what is known as Americans' sense that they had what was known as a manifest destiny, meaning that they were divinely called to control the North American, or at least what's now the continental 48 states, North American from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That it really was God's vision for the U.S. to expand from coast to coast. And so successive administrations all pursued annexation really at any cost, including what is unarguably genocidal treatment of Native Americans. The empire building with respect to annexation, we can look to James Polk's efforts just prior to the outbreak of the American Civil War to convince the U.S. Congress to annex Texas when it started to claim independence from Spanish Mexico. And then Polk will use, and Congress will be on board with this, a border dispute with Mexico, in relation to our effort to annex Texas as a basis for invading. So Polk, launches the U.S. launches the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, and it's just unarguably what would be considered today a very clear violation of international law on the use of force, use ad bello, rather. It's a war of aggression. It's a war against Mexico to seize large swaths of territory. It's territorial aggrandizement. It's growing the size of the American state through warfare in a clear war of aggression. Now, some of you may be saying, how is that consistent with isolationism? And my answer to that is, this is still a kind of inward-looking, however expansionist policy. This is about bringing that manifest destiny to fruition. So we're not engaging in alliances. We're not engaging in partial trade relationships. This war of aggression is just about kind of pursuing that manifest destiny, however horrifically and immorally, one might say. It's not, I don't think, or need not be seen as inconsistent with the overall policy of isolationism, which is to avoid those entangling political alliances with stronger, particularly European powers. So, as a result, the U.S. obtains what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah, an enormous chunk of the modern United States, and done so through, as I've said here, war of aggression. And so this is indeed empire building. Right? And then comes the Civil War. As I kind of alluded to already, the Civil War is seen by many as the representation of the emergence of modern warfare. And by modern warfare, we mean the mass production of modern instruments of war with the capacity for mass destruction. So it is unfortunate for those who had to fight this first, perhaps, modern war, because it will kill more Americans than all of the wars combined. But it's also not unreasonable to conclude that the Civil War, the victory by the North, and therefore one could say a victory by the state of the U.S., because the Civil War was, an unlawful rebellion by the South in defense of the indefensible institution of slavery. It is a military and diplomatic victory for the United States in that respect. I mean, it was painful, it was bloody, it was great loss. But it was through the, and I'm not going to go into the Civil War in any great depth, but it was through the adept, again, coercion, force, and diplomacy. Right? On the diplomatic front, the United States very adroitly, in very sophisticated ways, prevented European powers from successfully influencing the outcome of the Civil War, because there were, obvious, as we know now, very clear efforts on the part of European powers to see a Southern victory. So the Lincoln administration kind of won that diplomatic front, and obviously won the military campaign as well. So we emerge actually from the Civil War, moving in the direction of something quite significant, or perhaps from the perspective, or what would have been the perspective of the founders. And it's perhaps worth noting that really Lincoln and the Civil War leaders are the first generation of American leaders that were born after all of the independence period leaders had perished. So it is sometimes seen as the second generation of American leadership. So what they will set out to create in the post-Civil War period is perhaps would have been unthinkable or unimaginable by the framers, by the founders of the American Republic. Here again, however, like kind of as I said at the outset with Trump, tariffs are used to promote industry. Now, a point I have made in other contexts, but worth making here, absolutely worth making here, is that the use of tariffs, and if just to make sure everyone understands what I mean by tariff, tariffs are just taxes, taxes on imports. Many countries still use them today. Developing countries in particular often rely quite heavily on import tariffs because many developing countries do not have the state capacity to implement and successfully, implement successfly a kind of national income taxes and things like that. So import tariffs and duties are often quite important today still to many developing countries. But in the early post-war period, we're starting to see the emergence of American industrialism. Now, the Industrial Revolution, of course, began in Great Britain. It's come to America. It, came to America precisely at the time of the Civil War, which is what helped make the Civil War that first, modern war. In the post-war period, those industries are new still. They're infant or nascent industries. So the Northern-dominated Congress, and this is a point I tend to make about tariffs, and economists generally make this point, is the tariffs from this period to Trump, right? All have something in common: winners and losers. Right? So in the post-Civil War period, the Northern-dominated Congress imposes tariffs on the importation of European industrial manufactured goods. Why? Well, it's really the same reason that tariffs are always imposed, even today. It's to protect or promote the growth of domestic industry. And in the United States at that time, industry was a northern thing. Right? The South, as you probably might gather from slavery, the institutions, it was an agrarian society. But so industry, or the degree to which the Industrial Revolution had come to the United States, was a northern thing. So tariffs on imported industrial manufactured goods was really about protecting northern industries. And of course, the South hated that because that made the importing farming equipment and things like that, so that American northern industries could get off the ground and not have to compete with more established and therefore more efficient European industries off the ground. It made importing the things that Southern agrarian interests needed to import it much more expensive. Right? So tariffs, the point here, always have winners and losers. Right? You cannot aid one sector of an economy without unavoidably injuring or punishing another sector of the economy. And that's as true in the post-Civil War period as it is today with Trump's tariffs. Nevertheless, they worked. As a result of this protective posture adopted by the kind of winning side of the Civil War, the Northern-dominated Congress, names like Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller, those guys effectively created the world's most productive industrial complex. The U.S. will, of course, as you know, emerge as the world's most powerful economy fairly quickly. As I say, tariffs had a great deal to do with that, right? They protected these early steel, oil, these kind of early industries from protection protecting them from competition that they would likely lose because they would have had to trade or engage or compete with much more established, say, British industries, because the Industrial Revolution had been in Britain for several decades. So their industries were more established, therefore more efficient, could produce the same kind of products our nascent industries were just starting to learn how to produce at a much more efficient level, and thus could import them more cheaply than we could make them domestically. So those tariffs protected American industry, got them off the ground, and eventually came to constitute the American economic power that it is today, right? So, however, as I've said, as Trump has discovered, you can't favor one sector of a domestic economy without harming another. And so the agrarian South was harmed by the higher cost of imported European goods. Trump's efforts at protecting, auto manufacturers and what have you with his tariffs make consumers of those goods, suffer because the prices of those goods are going up. And of course, some have just simply left the country, as Harley Davidson and some of those have done. So again, learning from early foreign policy, Trump could have used a lesson or two. From the Civil War period, we're really now quite firmly laying the foundation for economic empire. This continued land expansion that I talked about first with the annexation prior to the Civil War continues in the post-Civil War era, the acquisition of Alaska from Russia. We start engaging in trade relationships with the Kingdom of Hawaii, but then, of course, we're just going to eventually just take it. We're going to depose the indigenous monarchical power in Hawaii and make Hawaii a state. 1874, as I note here, right, marks an important year in American history. It is the year that the U.S. first establishes a positive balance of payments, meaning it exports more than it imports. When it was a small fledgling country, it had to import much of what American citizens needed for consumption, everything from tea to farm implements. But in 1874, the U.S. exports for the first time at a greater value than the cost of what it imports. And it stays that way until the Cold War, when we start spending enormous amounts of money on, as you see, we're coming to that. So, 1874, we're now positive balance payments. We're now this exporting country, and we're making tons of money. We're just getting richer and richer and richer. Is kind of the idea here. And kind of at the center of that is this new emergent world financial center, New York. London is often seen as perhaps, it is appropriately seen as a critical financial center in the world. But New York, with the New York Stock Exchange emerging, really as the U.S. economic power grows to hegemonic status, when the U.S. takes over kind of global hegemony from Great Britain after World War II, New York will stand as the world's most important financial center. Another one might say, how can you be isolationist and do this? But here again, it's not the kind of entangling foreign policy that the early articulators of isolationism had warned against. But the Spanish-American War is, an aggressive war. 1898. This is about driving Spain out of the hemisphere, kind of the last European colonial power in the hemisphere. So, we drive Spain out of Cuba, but we're going to do so, however, and now we're going to start to see, kind of a certain character to American foreign policy that many are critical of, and certainly I think it's reasonable to be critical of it. So it's one thing to say there's something just or noble or morally upstanding or correct about driving colonial powers out of the hemisphere to liberate, for example, Cuba. Okay? So that's what the Spanish-American War does, is drives Spain out of Cuba, for example. However, it is very important to realize that the U.S. does so. It liberates Cuba, as I say here, in such a way that the competing forces within Cuba are recognized by American power or American leadership. And so our approach to liberating Cuba by driving Spain out was done in such, or was pursued in such a way that those who took power in Cuba were not the revolutionaries that would have threatened American economic interests, which by that time had already reached $50 million, right? So yes, the U.S. in the Spanish-American War drives the kind of last final colonial power out of the hemisphere, but it does so in a way that is clearly about protecting American economic interests in the region, right? And for Cuba, that means that those who come to power in Cuba are not going to be very nice guys to Cubans, for example, right? So we're going to help establish in this newly liberated Cuba a regime that is human rights violating, that is oppressive, particularly to the kind of peasant, indigenous population of Cuba, and will be so until Castro overthrows that system that we helped put in place. We also take Puerto Rico after the Spanish withdrawal. In the Pacific, the U.S. will take control of Guam, and the result of the Spanish-American War is that the Spanish are driven out of the Philippines, and we will, though Americans are fond of saying we've never been a colonial power, we basically take the Philippines as a colonial possession and treat it just like a colonial possession with the same philosophy, the same racist philosophy that undergirded colonialism everywhere else, that we were here to kind of uplift and civilize the Philippine population in a way that only this shining city on the hill could do. So now the U.S. is a force in Asia as well as this kind of growing hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere. And this new kind of presence in Asia naturally leads to, or I should say, is perfectly consistent with principles of American foreign policy, that have guided the Republic to date, and best seen through what are famously known as John Hay, the Secretary of State, who issued a kind of series of proclamations known as the Open Door Notes, and this was all about China, right? and Europe's kind of designs on China. Basically, Europe, as it will or has already begun to do with Africa, to kind of, as the King of Belgium's carve up the African magnificent cake, they have very similar interests in China. And the U.S. has no interest in seeing Europe do to China what it's done to Africa and carve it up into colonial spheres of influence. So the Open Door Notes kind of articulates a foreign policy toward China with respect to Europe, articulating two important principles, right? It insists, these Open Door Notes, which represent the articulation of U.S. policy with regard to China and Asia and Europe's presence in Asia, it insists that China will not, in fact, suffer the fate of Africa and be carved up by European powers. But it also insists that China will be open to U.S. trade and its missionaries. So we've got our own little cultural and economic imperial interests of our own. We're just opposed to European, more formal colonial and cultural imperialism. Right? But these principles, right, that are articulated in the Open Door Notes of John Hay need to be recognized. I want you to kind of see them, right, because they remain essential principles well into today, well into the 21st century. That is to oppose colonialism in general, European colonialism, right? So when Wilson comes to power, One of the most important principles that Woodrow Wilson will articulate is the principle of national self-determination. Qualified, as we'll see, but so opposed to European colonialism, kind of consistent with what will become the idea that China has a right to self-determination. Oh, bugger. And the second principle is the support for open foreign markets. So the kind of principle of self-determination, the opposition to colonialism, that the U.S. will maintain as a foreign policy, principal foreign policy element, right alongside the equally important principle of doing what it will, including the use of force, if necessary, to support open foreign markets. Those two twin principles will characterize a central thrust of American foreign policy for quite a long time. Then comes Teddy Roosevelt. Often, as I said earlier, sometimes foreign policy studies, textbooks, start with Teddy Roosevelt. Certainly, the study of the presidency, if you take a course on the U.S. presidency, for example, many of those courses start here. Like Mead says about foreign policy studies, it's often said about the study of American government, or the study of the American presidency. We tend to ignore all the kind of pre-modern presidents and tend to start with Teddy Roosevelt as kind of the precursor or a proto-modern president. He did a number of things that are worth referencing here in terms of early foreign policy. He took the side of Panama, which was at the time a part of Colombia. Panamanian resistance to kind of Colombian rule was seen by Roosevelt as a pretty good opportunity for something. And I don't know if you know where this is headed, but we side with the Panamanians in its revolt against Colombia, which was successful. And as a result of our assistance or our support for the Panamanian revolt against Colombia, Roosevelt's just going to basically demand this tranche, this 10-mile wide strand of land through the entirety of the new independent Panama so that we can build a canal there and shorten our distance to our trading partners by a very considerable degree. Again, we're using our force increasingly hegemonically in the Western Hemisphere. That still doesn't have to be seen as a violation of isolationism, if we understand isolationism to be kind of the establishment of permanent entangling alliances, especially with more powerful European states. This is an intervention, for sure. It is taking sides, as Washington said we shouldn't do. So in that sense, I suppose it's a violation of one of the cardinal principles of isolationism. But it's not an permanent entangling alliance with a more powerful entity that could threaten the United States by getting it drawn into a conflict it might lose. It's just beginning to flex its muscles that it has to start to really bring what the Monroe Doctrine had announced as policy, American hegemony in the hemisphere, to fruition, to bringing it to reality. And with respect to the Monroe Doctrine that we talked about earlier, one of the equally important foreign policy developments of the early or the pre-modern period is known as the Teddy Roosevelt corollary, and that's the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine of James Monroe. So I said Monroe really kind of announced this policy of pretension to hemispheric hegemony, driving or bringing an end to 3 centuries of European colonialism in the region, several decades before we actually had the military power to actually kind of back that policy up. By the time Teddy Roosevelt is president, we are approaching now the status of a military power that can actually act on its pronouncements. And so Roosevelt makes a very, very important, and for many, a rather disturbing announcement in what is, as I see here, known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, if you remember, was basically saying, Europe, you have to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It was a kind of a drawing a line between Europe and the Western Hemisphere and saying, basically, Europe, you're not welcome in the hemisphere if you have colonial. I mean, obviously, Europe's free to trade and do all those kinds of things, but Europe is no longer allowed to pursue colonial interests in the Western Hemisphere. So it's keeping Europe out of the Western Hemisphere. That was the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary is significantly more interventionist, right? If the Monroe Doctrine was saying Europe, you got to stay out, the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine takes that principle and adds to it a right of the U.S. not just to keep Europe out of the hemisphere, but to intervene in the hemisphere, in the internal affairs of our neighbors in the hemisphere when it's deemed to be in the interest of the United States. The language of the corollary was when there is enough instability, insecurity within a hemispheric state that the U.S. had a responsibility, is often the language, to use its military and economic power to intervene and reestablish stability for the good of the people of the country they might be intervening in. But of course, the real issue was intervening to bring an end to stability that threatened American economic interests, like, for example, one of the biggies of theirs, the United Fruit Company, Dole, and United Fruit Company. So these commercial interests in the region that would be threatened by, say, the possibility of civil war in a hemispheric country is now, under the terms of the Roosevelt Corollary, grounds for American military intervention to put an end to those sources of conflict and instability should they threaten American interests. So this is a very different ballgame. This is now a right to intervene in Latin American countries, whereas the Monroe Doctrine was simply a statement about keeping Europe out of it. So the U.S. has entered a new kind of era with Roosevelt. That's, again, why he's often viewed as kind of perhaps a proto-modern president. Then in 1907, 1909, in a conflict with Congress, which branch of government has the power to do what, he wanted to, as emerging or as established powers do, particularly naval powers, he felt it important to show to the world that the U.S. was now, in fact, an emergent world power, naval power. And the way that countries tend to do that is send their naval fleets on global excursions, kind of sail them around the world. And they go from port to port. And usually it's all very ceremonial, and the fleet is invited by the various countries into their ports, and celebrations, and diplomatic ties might be established in new ways. And Roosevelt felt it was time for the U.S. to do its thing, to do that sort of thing. But Congress didn't want to pay for it. There's still this heavily isolationist kind of philosophy at work in the American Republic. And so, the president has constitutional powers to kind of send, its military forces into combat, even. But the Constitution, at the time, was interpreted, I think, more literally, actually. It's Congress has the right to declare war, and it's Congress who has control over the purse strings, right? So Congress wasn't willing to just give Roosevelt the money to sail this massive fleet around the world. Roosevelt won the deal. What he did was basically tell Congress, okay, fine, I'm going to send the fleet out, and it'll make it to the Pacific, kind of the Asian Pacific. If you want to just leave the fleet stuck out there in Asia, you're free to do that and pay the political costs. I suspect you're actually going to fork up the money and pay to bring the fleet home. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So Roosevelt, was the first president to really show the world that we now had a naval power. We were becoming a naval power. And what navies do, in case you don't know this or haven't heard this, but navies are traditionally, and in today's world, aircraft carriers in particular, navies are essential, if perhaps not the most important, element of armed forces for the projection of power over distance. Right? States with naval power are states with the ability to project power over long distances. So this was a significant development in American foreign policy. This was telling the world we are becoming, or have become, a world power, like France, like Britain, like, not quite to the degree. I mean, Britain's still quite hegemonic at the time, but this was a very important development. This was the action of an emergent world power. Then, of course, Woodrow Wilson comes on the scene, and all of you have heard of Woodrow Wilson and know perhaps he's responsible for some very important ideas, in particular liberal internationalism. Right? The build-up to World War I that took place in Europe only rather slowly drew the U.S. out of its isolationist neutrality. It, tried to kind of stay neutral with respect to the German, Anglo, and French conflict. But eventually it became clear that it was in the U.S. interest to side with Britain and France against Imperial Germany and Austria. That Britain and France were emerging in this more liberal democratic direction. By then, of course, Britain had established the supremacy of the Commons. So now the House of Commons, the elected chamber of Parliament, was now sovereign. And, of course, post-revolutionary France. Well, there have been 5 democratic constitutions since the French Revolution, but it was certainly moving, with 1 or 2 restorations in there, in the direction much more consistent with American liberalism. So Wilson in the U.S., eventually sided with Britain and Germany, and of course that brings us into the war, precisely as Washington and Jefferson and all the isolationists, including the isolationists that were still in Congress, the Republicans for the most part, in Congress at the time, opposed. The isolationist spirit is still quite strong. Wilson is opposing that. Wilson is diametrically opposed to isolationism. Woodrow Wilson represents the most important challenge, kind of conceptual, philosophical challenge to isolationism, by representing what we refer to as variously liberal internationalism or liberal economic internationalism. It is the liberal vision of Woodrow Wilson that ultimately comes most directly into clash with the isolationist forces and principles of American foreign policy. And just as isolationists would have predicted, it was the taking the sides of Britain and France in World War I that got us involved in the war itself. This is also, I should say, where Wilson is a complex figure. He has this reputation, I think appropriately so, for being the kind of, I don't want to say father, it's a bit patriarchal language, but kind of the certainly one of the linchpins of contemporary liberal internationalism, and he was a far-sighted thinker in that respect. He was a political scientist who became the only political scientist to become president. So he did have a vision for the world that I think is a good one in many respects. But he was, in other respects, quite of the sort of American foreign policy leader that much of the world detests. Because when it came to some of the revolutions that were taking place at this very same time, the Mexican Revolution kind of overthrowing its autocratic system, the revolution in China that brought the nationalists to power, and then when they suffered, the communists would eventually come, and then of course the Russian Revolution in 1917. All of these are happening kind of around the same time, and Wilson opposes each and every one of them. Wilson opposes this kind of revolutionary change, the spirit of revolutionary change that is in the air at the time of his administration. And so he often sides, in each one of those cases, with the wrong guys, right? I mean, he sides with Tsarist Russia. The U.S. actually sends American forces to Russia to try to defend the Tsarist system. So on the one hand, Wilson's envisioning this kind of liberal international economic order, liberal democracy and human rights and national self-determination, all those ideas. But, the revolution's trying to free countries from really oppressive systems, Mexico, China, he opposes them all. So he's got his other side to him. And then, of course, as I'll say in a second, he's also, on a very personal level, a deeply problematic human being. So the point here is the post-war vision, post-World War I vision of a liberal international order centered on the League of Nations that was absolutely envisioned, or the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson and his liberal internationalists. The idea, just to give you a sense of why they're so interested in institutions like the League of Nations, is what makes them liberal. Because remember, you Americans in the class, remember we're the only country in the world that uses liberal in the way we use it. Everywhere else in the world, it kind of means almost the opposite, kind of conservative economic, free market thinking and all that kind of stuff. For Wilson and his liberal internationalists, the idea is that we could create a new order. One of the central principles of liberal thinking, whether it's John Locke or John Stuart Mill or Adam Smith or French liberals like Kant, you name it, right? All have a belief in or a faith in the possibility of progress in human affairs, and that extends to international relations. So these liberal internationalists are fundamentally opposed to the European tradition of the balance of power politics, the Realpolitik of Otto von Bismarck of Germany, for example. They envision the creation of a world order grounded in institutions that would facilitate the emergence of trust between states required for the kind of cooperation among self-interested rational states that realists will later come to say is pie in the sky thinking of idealists. The kind of centerpiece, I should say, of Wilson's vision for the world is captured well in his speech to the U.S. Congress before the end of World War I, in which he articulated 14 points that should constitute the kind of vision that the U.S. should pursue in the post-war era. And I'm not going to click on that. That's a hot link. You can do it yourself. Or just Google 14 points. And because I don't know what hitting that will do to the narration of this of this keynote presentation. But follow that link, or if you have trouble doing it, just Google 14 points. It's a short speech, and you will see what constitutes the Wilsonian vision of liberal internationalism. Free trade, free markets, freedom of the high seas, open diplomacy, no more secret agreements, that kind of stuff. It's just kind of a new idea for a new political order. And it's Wilsonian. That's why it's often referred to as kind of a Wilsonian vision. So after the war, Wilson works diligently, in fact, so diligently that he will end up having a stroke and dying, probably from exertion. But he works assiduously to see his vision brought to fruition, the implementation of his liberal agenda. And as I say, a liberal agenda, sort of, because on the personal level, I can't not say this, but he's a deeply, deeply unreconstructed racist. Kind of on a personal level, he's a horrible human being in some respects, right? I mean, the White House, the institution of the presidency, the White House has been desegregated since the Civil War. Wilson comes along, we're in the 20th century, and he resegregates the White House. He essentially dismisses all of the African-American staff in the White House and recreates an entirely Caucasian staff. So on a personal level, he's a pretty ugly guy. He's a Southerner from, I think, Virginia, and he's just dyed-in-the-wool Southern racist. So I suppose that makes him a complex human being, like all human beings, I guess. But I always think it's worth mentioning what he was like on a personal level. Again, the League of Nations, linchpin of the Wilsonian vision, as an institution that could help states forge a basis for trust and cooperation, and thus create a new world order, more peaceful, more just than the balance of power, Bismarckian European world order that had been the nature of things for seemingly forever. But of course, Wilson fails fundamentally this project. He fails to convince the Republican Congress to sign and ratify the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, which created the League of Nations. The U.S. Senate, as you may or may not know, has the important role. Presidents establish treaties, write out the terms, but the Senate has to approve them, and he could not convince the Republican-dominated Senate to approve the treaty, and thus the U.S. never joins this fundamental linchpin institution of the New World Liberal Order. And because we are emerging, we're not going to fully emerge as the world's hegemon until after World War II, but it's clear that we're well on the road, well on the way to that status. If we don't join the League of Nations, we doom it to failure. And of course, the League of Nations fails. Because the function of the League of Nations, if it had one function, it was to prevent World War II. Or it was to make sure that World War I, known then as the war to end all wars, stayed that way. But of course, we know good and well that it does not do that. We go back to isolationism. Wilson dies. Literally, he passes away. And with him, it seems the liberal international vision of the United States that would have transformed American foreign policy from its isolationism to world engagement. And so after World War I, we return to an isolationist stance. We draw down our military forces quite dramatically. We retrench back to a kind of inward-looking stance, reestablish kind of nationalist economic policies that are sometimes known as beggar thy neighbor policies by using tariffs and those kinds of things. And so does the rest of the world, in fact. So does Europe in particular. And as a result of that return to those nationalist economic policies on the part of the U.S. and elsewhere, we get here. So I think it's reasonable to say that the failure of the U.S. to join and help lead the institution of the League of Nations, we end up with World War II. I'm not going to go into the war. We know how it ends. I think the more important points for us is that the U.S. emerges from World War II finally and eminently clearly as the world's leading economic, political, and military power. We eclipse Great Britain. This is the end of British hegemony, right? I mean, this was up until this point. British control of the high seas. The British naval power was unprecedented. A long period known as Pax Britannia, peace by British hegemony, comes to an end. Really, it is said that World War I and World War II were the kinds of conflicts one expects when a hegemonic power like Britain is in decline. So World War II ends with just absolute clarity that Britain has lost its hegemonic status. And the U.S. will now recognize that as the world's leading economic, political, and military power, it really can't turn back to isolationism. It will, in fact, forever reject isolationism as a grand strategy. Now, I know Donald Trump has isolationist tendencies, and who knows where the widespread success of right-wing populist and left-wing populist forces across the globe is taking the world order. But isolationism ends, finally. So what we talked about is, kind of the founding republic principle of isolationism doesn't really get buried until the end of World War II. And it's largely because it's kind of possible in some respects, right? With Europe in absolute shambles, right, after the end of World War II, and Germany completely demolished. I mean, scorched earth policies work, right? So Europe, Japan in ashes, the atomic bombing of Japan, the firebombing of Dresden, China, other parts of Germany, China in complete disorder. The nationalist revolution now being overtaken by the communist revolution soon. So China in great disorder. It really is the U.S. alone. And it has no longer anything to fear from political involvement in the world, given Europe's in ashes, Japan's in ashes, China's in disarray. We don't have the same reason to fear entanglement that we had when we were a weaker power, and entanglement could have meant getting drawn into conflicts that would destroy us, or have the terms of our entanglement dictated to us by more powerful states. All of that's no longer the case. Right? In fact, it can not just engage in the world; it's going to lead it. Right? But of course, it doesn't stay harmonious for very long. We very quickly end up with the Cold War. Be right back. Okay, so how did we get from allies with the Soviet Union in the war against fascism to the Cold War? Well, if you've started the reading for Monday, you've got a piece written by Schlesinger, oddly, talking as if the Cold War is over, because it was written at a time where there was kind of a emergent moment of détente, or a softening of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, following the very near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so that piece will have a different spin on the origins of containment than the one we're discussing this week, or last week, whatever. So where does it come from? How does the United States end up rejecting isolationism that had really been American grand strategy from the founding of the Republic in 1776 until 1947, 48, 49, 50. I mean, it really lasts that long. With that blip of Wilsonian liberal international efforts that we retrenched from at the end of World War one. Where does this come from? How does it happen? Well, the idea of giving you the Kennan piece, published in Foreign Policy, is that it contains, it's not just an article from Foreign Policy magazine. There's a history before and after this article that you read in Foreign Policy magazine that's really quite important to understand for several reasons. One, just to see how important this one person, George Kennan, is in the history of American foreign policy and his ideas, perhaps more importantly. Although Kennan, as I've already alluded to, kind of spent the rest of his career, he ended up leaving government, going into higher education, and professor at Harvard, complaining that his ideas were abused, misrepresented, and poorly and counterproductively implemented. I think it's not unreasonable to take the position that Kennan's article in Foreign Policy that you read and the precursor to it that I'm about to explain can reasonably be said to have called for kind of precisely what we ended up doing. But nevertheless, he insists, and there are also signs or essential passages that do support Kennan's view that he was not calling for the kind of hardcore militarist approach to containment that does come to constitute or represent American foreign policy of containment. In this telegram that had been requested by the state. Hello? Okay, old building, building A. Yeah, I'll be right down. Okay. Okay, so I think I failed to hit pause, so I suspect you heard me having a little chat with the delivery guy. One of the shortcomings of this technology is that you cannot just delete portions of the narration. You have to start the whole bloody thing over, and I'm not going to do that. So yeah, my dinner's here. All right. Anyway, the second of the 2 points here about this kind of the complications of Soviet foreign policy being both easier and more complicated. Easier in the sense they get power, they get the understanding of power, so they'll be prepared to yield if we show sufficient force, if the free world is, others will say, adequately demonstrate a will to, take the tough stands that need to be taken. The Soviet Union will back down, and they won't have any compulsion about doing so because, again, it's all part of a historical, inevitable progression towards the inevitable collapse of capitalism. However, what this means is, so it's rational in that sense. It's it's sensitive to power and all that. That, however, means that they're not going to be defeated or even, as he says, discouraged by these kinds of defeats, right? I mean, if it's all part of an inevitable destruction of capitalism, there's no reason to get discouraged or bummed out by, failing to gain a new client in Southeast Asia or Africa or wherever. They're going to win it in the long run, they think. So Soviet policy is going to be difficult. They're going to be hard to deal with for a very long time, and we're just going to have to, get okay with that. So, what's the, what do we do? Well, Kennan's pretty clear, I think. The patient persistence by which the Soviet Union is animated, that can be effectively countered, is not by sporadic acts which represent the momentary whims of democratic opinion, he says, but only by intelligent, long-range policies on the part of Russia's adversaries, the U.S. leading the free world. Policies that are as steady and purpose as the Soviets, and no less variegated and resourceful in their application than those of the Soviet Union itself. Now, I think it's critically important to look at some of this language, just real quick. No less variegated and resourceful. Cannon will kind of look to that language and say, you didn't read me closely enough when you just later decided on a almost uniquely militarist approach. And I think that's not a fair characterization of our containment policy either. I think it clearly did militarize foreign policy, but containment, as we will see, was consisted of many things, not just the use or threat of use of force. Nevertheless, he's pretty clear here that we have to adopt policies that are, rational, well thought out, long-range vision. God darn it. All right, guys, I'm not sure if I'm repeating myself here. It didn't look like it had started to record. I'm sorry about this. If this is a few moments of redundancy, I apologize. The bottom line here, Soviet policy is both easier and more complicated than, say, Napoleon or Hitler. It's simpler because it's rational. It understands the logic and practice of power. So it will be under no hesitation to stand down when it is presented with superior force and power. However, that means, right, because for the Soviets this is all about the long-term inevitable collapse of capitalism anyway, that they're just going to try to help along, that they're not going to get defeated or discouraged by these individual losses or capitulations that they might need to make in the face of superior force. They are in it for the long haul. To see what he's not proposing, it is often what historians of foreign policy like John Lewis Gaddis, who you'll hear from in just a minute, Kennan is arguing for a kind of third alternative or a third way of dealing with the Soviet Union. Notice here he says, it is important to note that this policy of containment has nothing to do with outward histrionics, this kind of blustering, Trump kind of approach, right? Where you tweet at 3:30 in the morning calling the head of the North Korea shrimp and the guy with a smaller button than he has. That's not going to fly with the Soviet Union, right? It doesn't have anything to do with threats or blustering or superfluous gestures of outward toughness, right? It is absolutely essential. It is the essential component. It is the sine qua non of a successful approach to Russia that the foreign government, like us in question, should and must remain cool at all times, cool and collected, and that this is critical, and that its demands that it makes on Russian policy should be advanced, should be articulated in such a way as to leave the way open for a compliance by Russia that is not too detrimental to Russian prestige. Kind of good old-fashioned conflict resolution kind of ideas, right? Don't make demands that would lead to the loss of face by the Soviet Union, because they won't make them. If you can, he's obviously calling for pursuing a tough foreign policy approach, but not one that disregards the way Russia needs to be approached. Yeah. Again, just to kind of reiterate, the U.S. has in its power to increase enormously the strains under which Soviet policy must be formulated or operate. We can force the Kremlin into a greater degree of moderation and circumspection by, this smart, rational, long-term, patient policy of containment, by putting pressure. As you read, he's going to kind of focus on the younger generation in Russia. I mean, he's thoroughly convinced, and I think it's reasonable assessment of Soviet structure and social, the kind of political economy of the Soviet Union, did not serve the economic, certainly the political interests of the vast majority of the Soviet public. So the idea is to, recognize that, do what we can, and that's why for Kennan, containment would have involved cultural exchange, and it does eventually. Cultural exchanges and all those kinds of things that will help the Soviet public see the superiority of the Western way of life, and then put pressure on its own regime to adopt more accommodationist liberal policies. So, as I've said, Kennan, long telegram, then the X article, really do give him an extraordinary place in the history of American foreign policy, because what comes next, right? So the long telegram was what, 46, 45, 46. The X telegram, the X article, I believe it was 1947. Then comes NSC 68, requested by Truman of his National Security Council to formulate a strategy, a long-term strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union. Truman has read the long telegram. Now he wants his National Security Council to make a set of proposals about what to do with the Soviet Union. And NSC 68, as I've already alluded to, as I've already alluded to, really does adopt much of Kennan's framework and ideas, right? However, it's, Kennan's out now by then of the State Department, and he's going to go back to the academy. And in come these, as I say, unapologetic hardline realists, particularly offensive realists, if you guys know the distinction there. Dean Acheson as well. Dean Acheson and Paul Nitze. When we get a chance to watch the film on the Cuban Missile Crisis, we'll get a caricature, not a caricature, I think we'll get a pretty good depiction of Dean Acheson, because he's this old Cold Warrior, principal drafter of NSC 68, so kind of known as fighting the Soviets for a long time. And when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes, Kennedy actually reaches out to Acheson and asks him to come to the White House and participate in these very secretive meetings of what he calls the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. So Acheson, hardline, Paul Nitze, hardline realist. Instead of Kennan, who was a Soviet Russian specialist, who had this kind of broader vision of containment, I would argue, those who actually draft the policy documents presented to the President of the United States and that become the actual policies are of a different sort than George Kennan. George Kennan spent, as I've already mentioned a couple of, the rest of his life arguing that these guys, Acheson, Nitze, and the rest of them, misinterpreted and or abused his ideas for an approach to containment. And he actually came to believe that the approach to containment that Dean Acheson and others, set in motion actually became far more dangerous than the thing they were trying to contain, specifically the possibility of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So he was, for the rest of his life, quite disappointed with the way containment kind of played out. But as I say, NSC is structured quite similarly to and relies on many, many of Kennan's insights. So as the long telegram and others are, right, it kind of has the same kind of structure, right? It starts, however, quite ominously. It's they're selling a package here. They're selling it to President Truman, who they know will then have to sell it to the American people. So the document kind of begins with a very stark, ominous, dark kind of representation of the issue. And it says, the issues that face us are momentous. involving the fulfillment or destruction not only of this republic, but of all of civilization itself. You will see later that as late as President Eisenhower will speak of the destruction of civilization at stake in the Cold War. So these ideas resonate. They are good PR guys as well as kind of political strategists. They are issues, they say, which will not await our deliberations. So, this is an unhelp. This is scary, basically. We don't have time to think about it, is what they're saying. We just need to act. We need to act now, right? With conscience and resolution, this government and the people it represents must now take new and fateful decisions. And that's just language that should bother anyone. If you're talking about embarking on an entirely new, radically different grand strategy that indeed poses the risk of nuclear Armageddon, and you're saying we don't have time to even think about it, you should think about it. But nevertheless, that was their approach. So what are these issues that they're referring to? Well, they're, again, kind of Kennan's ideas, right? The implacable purpose of the slave state. Notice this is darker, more contentious language than Kennan is using to describe the Soviet Union, but it's many of the same essential ideas. Out to eliminate the challenge of freedom, and that has placed the two great powers into this intractable conflict. It is this fact which gives the present polarization of power the quality of crisis. In the view of the Soviet Union, the threat moving toward an existential threat rapidly, right? And they, kind of go through this analysis of what's going on in the Soviet Union, the build-up, and they were building up their military. They're always talking throughout the document about this growing gap and the falling behind of the U.S., falling behind the Soviet Union in terms of military strength and power. And they look at things like, the USSR is spending 40% of its GDP on the military, which is actually quite an extraordinary percentage of GDP. That's actually similar to like 16th century spending on military, when upwards of 75% of a crown's budget went to the military. And the U.S. was only spending 22%. So they were saying, clearly we're going to fall behind at this if we continue this, to allow this disparity in spending to continue. However, it's important to note, right, that 40% of GDP for the USSR totals about $65 billion a year, while only, I kind of had that wrong, 22% of GDP for the USA is $255 billion a year. So, yes, we're spending less as a percent of GDP, but because the size and productivity of our economy, that's almost 4 times we're spending yearly on the military in the Soviet Union. But they still represent that as dangerously inadequate, right? So they're kind of creating this sense of crisis. So they suggest there are 4 basic possible courses of action that the president can consider. The first one is status quo, just going to, keep spending 22%, and we're going to keep falling farther and farther behind. Go back to isolationism, give up on the idea of engaging in leading the New World Order. Offensive war, again, I told you that there were serious voices in the foreign policy establishment that were advocating surprise attack against the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And then there's Kennan's third way, and that's the one that they're obviously arguing for. But again, they have, in Kennan's view, and in some respects I think he's right, a much more militarized conception of containment. Quote, a more rapid buildup of the political, economic, and military strength of the free world, with the purpose of reaching, if possible, a tolerable state of order among nations without war, and of preparing to defend ourselves in the event that the free world is attacked. So it's, again, absolutely the epicenter of Kennan's principle that is, we don't have to do war and we don't have to capitulate. There is this third way that makes Kennan memorable. Kennan's basic idea that containment could lead the Kremlin to eventually change its ways was maintained in NSC 68. To quote the document, to create political and economic conditions in the free world, backed by sufficient force, so we can have that strong foreign policy, to inhibit Soviet attack, so that the Kremlin will have to accommodate itself to these conditions and eventually change its policy. This is Kennan re-articulated in kind of more forceful terms in NSC 68. But as I said, the nature of that firm, constant pressure was not entirely what Kennan seems to have had in mind. The proposal is essential to establish and lead an international. I think this is actually might surprise some people. NSC is calling for American hegemonic leadership of a new world order. Now, these are hardcore realists, right? Atchison, Mitsu, and these guys. Yet they are, as Deutsch says in the article that I had you read, even containment was in some significant way predicated on liberal international values. These guys in NSC 68 are calling for the construction of an international liberal economic order backed up by sufficient military power to defend and to defend that order, and by kind of deterring Soviet attacks on it. And they offer a truly global liberal internationalist vision. When they talk about what the U.S. needs to be prepared to do and who it needs to be prepared to defend, the list is extraordinary. So they start with, obviously, the homeland and our neighbor Canada. Don't mention Mexico for some reason. And then secondly, we need to be prepared to defend our traditional allies, the United Kingdom and Western Europe. But also, Alaska, the Western Pacific, and Africa, right? And the Near and Middle East, right? So we are talking, NSC 68 is visioning global hegemonic role for the U.S., right? And nothing less than that. It's clear that it is heavily dominated by a military dimension, in particular offensive realism. The idea that the call is for the need for an offensive capability, not just an ability to defend against attack, but an offensive capability to strike first with a powerful and defeating strength, so that we can pursue this, quote, strong foreign policy that will deter Soviet aggression. Their thinking was, if you read NSC 68, and again, I think I'll post it for you in case you're interested, their historical analysis is that World War I and World War II were won by the militarily more powerful, but those victorious powers were not powerful enough to have prevented those wars by having been able to pursue a strong enough foreign policy prior to the outbreak of war to prevent war. And that's what they're saying we need to do, is build up such a degree of offensive military capability that we can pursue the kind of strong foreign policy that was not possible and therefore did not prevent World War I and World War II. So, military. The political and economic dimensions are clear too. We need to pursue programs designed to build and maintain global confidence in our economic system and our leadership of it. Right? So again, these realists are nevertheless clearly accepting principles of what we'll come to know later as kind of neoliberal institutionalism or the liberal school of international relations theory. They are talking about the building of a new world order predicated on liberal internationalist principles, guided by the hegemonic power of the United States, backed up by the military force of the leader of the free world and its allies. This will allow us to increase, or this will also involve an increase in economic assistance to developing countries that could, be sitting on the fence, go Soviet, go Western. Increase our economic development assistance to poorer countries and be prepared to maintain those assistance programs as long as they are necessary. And so here we see, I can't remember if I put it, no, I did not. This is really what we call today, or constructivists call, the securitization of development assistance, or it's using development aid for national security purposes. Right? They also call for substantial, obviously very substantial, but they're never clear about how much exactly this is going to cost. They say it's going to cost more, they're going to have to raise taxes, Americans are going to have to make sacrifices, but they are never willing to put a price tag, anything like a price tag, on their policies. And that's the sort of kind of pathetic weakness of Atchison and company. They are making very clear what the issues are, what the threats are, and what's needed, and yet they're not willing to put anything like a dollar price tag. And, they've got plenty of ways they could have estimated, and they just never do. And I think that's irresponsible. It's undemocratic. It's non-transparent because, as we'll see in a little bit, it's reasonable that a democratic republic and a public in a democratic republic have a right to know that what they're being asked to do will cost X or somewhere in the neighborhood of X, and yet they're just never willing to go there. We need to increase our military assistance to our allies and partners, and again, maintain that assistance for as long as it seems necessary. Call for an increase in covert operations of advancing. So this is pretty, leads to some pretty nasty stuff. This will lead to, the use of covert instruments, and later in the course we'll explore these more directly. But they're saying, let's be prepared to engage in covert activities, and that will not just mean intelligence gathering, but of course will mean the overthrow of unfriendly governments, or what they see as unfriendly governments, from Mossad in Iran to left-wing governments in Latin America that were democratically elected, like Pinochet in Chile, that bring in brutal, horrible dictatorships who commit mass atrocities against their people, but they are not in the Soviet camp. So it's going to have a pretty nasty element to it as well. Also develop internal security, which is also rather frightening, because what this will lead to is the use of the FBI by Herbert Hoover to spy on the Black Panther Party or liberal organizations. It will directly lead, I think, to what's known famously as the Red Scare in the United States, where Senator Joseph McCarthy will lead for several years a campaign to call out these hidden communists in the United States. And that will help destroy, actually, the State Department, because he will go after bureaucrats in the State Department in particular, and particularly those with expertise in countries that are now communist. So those with Russian specialties or Chinese specialties. He's going to accuse so many of them of being communist sympathizers that they'll all be driven out of the State Department. And, I think students of Asian politics and the Chinese Revolution are right to point out that when the slogan was in American foreign policy that when China fell, when Mao won the revolution in China, it was described in the U.S. as having lost China. Well, I think it's very reasonable to say that Americans, quote, lost China, because the Red Scare, led by people like, the just fanatically right-wing McCarthy and his comrades, comrades, wrong word there, his equally jackbooted thugs, had destroyed all the expertise in our State Department that, all the people that knew anything about Asia had been kicked out because they were either accused of communism or just no longer wanted to be a part of that kind of world. So we just didn't have the brain trust, if you will, in foreign policy circles that could have foretold and perhaps helped the U.S. change the outcome. I don't know if that would have been a good thing or not, probably, given 30 million people that perished in the Cultural Revolution, all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, the loss of China, as the Americans put it, was ironically the result of the hardcore right-wing crazies that took some of these elements of NSC 68 to their maximum extreme. Augment intelligence gathering, intelligence capabilities, and then this is interesting. Reduce, it's a very clear call. I think I'm quoting this, if I'm not mistaken. Reduction in federal expenditures for purposes other than defense and foreign assistance. So they're on the one hand calling for a massive, radical military buildup and all that that's going to cost, although never putting a price tag on it. But they are willing to say, and it needs to come at the expense of social welfare programs. In other words, in my view, Europe, because the U.S. is going to spend the bulk of this, will have the resources to build their new, rather impressive welfare states. The U.S. will not. The U.S. will gain the world's largest, most impressive military, and we're going to leave millions of Americans without health insurance and those kinds of things. So one thing Trump, kind of has a point about, but misunderstands the nature of hegemony, is his complaint that Europeans haven't contributed enough to NATO, that the U.S. has, always paid more. Well, that is true. At some point, we're going to have a conversation about what hegemons do. And that's one thing that Trump just doesn't understand, is that one of the things that hegemonic powers do, whether it's Britain during the period of Pax Britannia or all the way back to Rome and Pax Romana, hegemons help produce what are called public goods. Things that markets don't produce and have these certain qualities, like security, global security, or environmental cleanliness, or what. Public goods. Hegemons produce those for world orders, and they do so often allowing others to kind of free ride. The reason they allow that free riding is because the hegemon benefits to a greater degree than anybody else by the order that they are establishing. So even if people, quote, cheat by, say, in the Europe case, not contributing as much as the U.S. to defense of Europe as the U.S., the U.S. still ends up profiting more than anybody else from the order that they have established hegemonically. So we can say more about that at another time. So, all right, to kind of close this, I just wanted to kind of talk about, and this is some of the stuff that I said just took me ages to kind of really find a way to test some alternative hypotheses and affirm this proposition that I've made many, many times in teaching this course. That NSC 68 is, of course, unarguably radically transformative of American foreign policy. And the point I want you to remember, if nothing else, is that NSC 68 massively, radically militarizes U.S. foreign policy. In other words, the result of the adoption of the ideas of NSC 68 by Truman and his successors means that as we move through the Cold War, following this policy of containment, we will predominantly rely on but one of the many categories of foreign policy instruments available to us, and that's the military. We have covert, we have economic, we have cultural, soft, smart power. We have all these instruments of foreign policy that are available. NSC 68, as it's articulated, and as it's adopted and implemented by Truman and his successors, is predominantly reliant on that military instrument of foreign policy. So it is totally reasonable to say that the principal impact of NSC 68 on U.S. foreign policy is its militarization. But what I have also said is that NSC 68 establishes a new benchmark for a continued growth in economic spending. And as I say, I've said that many, many times. I made this point every time I taught this course, but I've never taken the time to do what I've done over the last 24 or 48 hours. And that's kind of test some of the data and kind of look at it in different ways. And I have basically affirmed what I have been saying, so I can say what I've been saying all along with a bit more confidence than I'm not just making some assumptions. So what you see in this chart, titled The Impact of NSC 68 Cold War Military Spending, you'll note that the first date is 1948. Following the end of World War II, there was a dramatic reduction in military spending because the war was over. So it falls in 1947, 1948 to $157 billion. Now, these are all, I've adjusted all these figures into 2012 dollars, and I can at another time tell you why I chose 2012. But so all these figures that you're going to see are constant dollars are 2012, accounted for inflation, so that when we look back at earlier numbers, those numbers are what they would be worth in 2012. So in 1948, we can see here that military spending was $157 billion. Now, that's right about the time that Kennan writes the long telegram, then the X article, and then in 1950, NSC 68 is written and gets adopted, and boom, you can see that jump from 208 to $354 billion. That is the initial escalation of military spending called for by NSC 68, and I should say made possible by the Korean War. Once the Chinese got involved in the Korean War and pushed the American and Allied forces from the Yalu River all the way almost to the bottom of the peninsula, that convinced the American public, Congress, that yep, we face an implacable threat. And so the spirit and the letter of NSC 68 finally gets what it needs. In fact, I think it was Dean Acheson or Paul Nitze. One of them said, Korea saved us. They think without the Korean War, the NSC 68 formula would not have been adopted. But it was. And you can see that from that period, now there's variation. You can see ups and downs, but the trend line that is statistically fit to this data is a direct, clear, positive increase from year to year. Right? I mean, it's an upward slope, and I've even calculated the slope of this fit line. Right, and I'm just going to say a couple of things about some of the numbers. You don't have to remember all the math here, but I just want to point out a couple of things here. The y equals 6.6x. Right? And what that means is that according to the best fit line, for every year that you move forward, you get, on average, an increase of about $6.6 billion in U.S. spending. Right? And that starts with NSC 68. So that was my initial kind of proposition that I wanted to kind of confirm. So this first chart shows that because of NSC 68, we get this dramatic spike in spending, and then though there is reductions and re-escalations, and that trend line shows that throughout the whole of the Cold War until its very end, for every year we advance through the Cold War, we spend an extra $6.7 billion more on military spending than the year before. The R squared figure, I don't, we don't have to go into the statistics of that, but what that number means, at 0.69, says that this model, this year-to-year model, explains about 70% of the variation in year-to-year spending, right? So those fluctuations, the up and down, and the general direction of upwards over time, about 70% of that variation is explained simply by year-to-year movement through the Cold War, which, again, I argue suggests the long-term impact of the initial implementation of NSC 68. But I wasn't. And then the other figure, the plus 241. So if you remember your algebra or whatever, y equals mx plus b. That b is the intercept across the y-axis, and that y-axis on the left there, the numbers 100, 200, 300, 400, those are in billions of dollars, right? Notice that the trend line predicts that we would cross that y-intercept at the amount of $241 billion spending. But because of that massive spike, thanks to NSC 68 adoption, it overestimates that intercept by about $100 billion, right? If you look at that 1948 figure, that's really where the beginning crosses the y-intercept at 152 billion. So that also shows the impact of NSE 68. The trend line established over the course of the Cold War as a result of NSE 68 adoption means that we spend every year about $6.7 billion more than the year before on military spending, regardless of what's going on, regardless of external conditions, right? Just on average, every year, add $6.7 billion to military defense. And it post-dicts where we should have started, given how much we end up spending, by about $100 billion. So the NSC 68 is clearly quite influential. Now, the next chart I've got here is looking at spending trends prior to the adoption of NSC 68. So this is defense spending from the beginning of the 20th century, 1900, up to 1947, into World War II. And as you can obviously see, for most of the first half of the century, very little growth in military spending. Two spikes, World War I, and then the massive spike in World War II. And so that trend line is heavily influenced by the World War II spike. If it weren't for that World War II spike, that trend line would be essentially flat. But as it is, because of World War II, we get an increase averaged over the period of $8.2 billion every year, only because World War II is such an enormous, extraordinary, unique explosion in spending that it skews the data for the entire period. But you'll notice that the R squared is so much smaller, meaning because that World War II experience is so peculiar, so spectacularly out of the ordinary for this range, that the model of going from year to year only explains 27% of the variation from year to year from that trend line. So it's not a good model, right? So prior to NSE 68, we don't have a good explanation for the variation in military spending that we have after NSE 68 is adopted. And then the y-intercept of 107 billion on the trend line underestimates by $100 billion, the actual amount of spending at the onset of that period. And that's, again, because the trend line is so heavily skewed by World War II. So what this suggests is, in comparison to the post-adoption of NSE 68, which gives us a model that explains 70% of the variation in spending. So it's a much better fit. That line much better fits the data. And a y-intercept that actually overestimates the initial spending condition. We have quite the opposite. We have a very weak model, doesn't explain very much, and that kind of underestimates the initial spending condition. And then we take the entire period of the 20th century, or beginning of the 20th century to the end of the Cold War, and we have a model with an R-squared of 0.61. So the trend line, the model from year to year, kind of change in spending from year to year, that's the model, explains about 60% of the variation in spending. So not as strong, not as impressive as the model that shows the impact of NSE 68, but far more powerful a model than the pre-NSE 68. It has a y-intercept that also underestimates the beginning by about minus 76, and so about $70 billion, right? But again, this is all skewed by this enormous World War II extraordinary, unique level of spending. And when we take that out in this final model, if we just take the extraordinary, and this is not uncommon for statisticians to take out extreme or outlier data points, as it's called, you get a better representation of normal relationships and normal data. So I drop the 4 years of the truly extraordinary levels of spending for World War II, and we end up with a model like this. A model that says, on average, over the course of the 20s, from the 20th century to the end of the Cold War, a yearly increase in military spending of $7.2 billion. Just 1 year after the next accounts for about an additional $7.2 billion in spending. But it's clear, right, that can only really be made sense of by seeing the adoption of NSE 68 right in the middle of that graph, right? Because the first half of the century, clearly we're not adding $7.2 billion every year. It's really the impact that 7.2 figure, meaning the slope of the line. So for every year we move forward, we add $7.2 billion in spending, is only possible, is only explicable by the adoption of NSE 68 policies. The R-squared, how much of the variation in spending from year to year is explained by the model? 85%. So it's an extraordinarily powerful model. And it too has a y-intercept, that trend line, intercepts this y-axis on the left at negative 109, a negative $109 billion. So again, it shows that in the absence of the adoption of NSE 68, perhaps conversely, with the adoption of NSE 68, the model underestimates what we would be spending by about $102 billion, right? So it just kind of shows, in multiple ways, I think I've tried to show here, that the adoption of NSE 68 in 1950 and then the Korean War that made it, selling it to the American people possible, leads to, you can see from that point on, a permanent, regular, yearly, with variation from year to year, but over time, a trend line that is clearly positive and fairly linear, adding $7 billion a year to defense spending, regardless of conditions. And that, my friends, I think is the impact of NSC 68. Now, there are other explanations. We're reaching the 2 hour and 34-minute. I think what we have here are just a couple of clips that I'm going to show. The first one is really interesting. It's President Eisenhower's farewell, and I've parsed it down to 6 minutes. President Eisenhower served from the post-Korean War, 1953 to the end of the decade, when Kennedy became president. President Eisenhower, if you don't know, before he was President Eisenhower, was General Eisenhower. In fact, not just any old general. He was the supreme Allied commander in World War II, in charge of all the Allied. He was a military man his whole life. He served 50 years in public office, 8 of it as president, the rest of it in the military. These are his final remarks to the American people, and I want you to pay attention to 2 or 3 things he has to say here about what we need to be vigilant about. And then we're going to see precisely what he warned us about. Because what I'm saying here is, yes, NSC 68 had a very clear, very demonstrable effect on not just the militarization of American foreign policy, but the spending increases that just continue to escalate throughout the rest of the Cold War period. But there are other explanations for what we see, and President Eisenhower on his way out has this to say.
From the White House in the office of the President of the United States, we present an address by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the farewell address for President Eisenhower, whose 8 years as chief executive come to an end at noon Friday. Mr. Eisenhower has chosen this time for his final speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
3 days from now, after half a century in the service of our country, I shall lay down the responsibilities of office as, in traditional and solemn ceremony, the authority of the presidency is vested in my successor. This evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Despite these holocausts, America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty, the state. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human betterment. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. Good judgment seeks balance and progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. The record of many decades stands as proof that our people and their government have, in the main, understood these truths and have responded to them well in the face of threat and stress. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise. Of these I mention two only. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizen can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. During the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Such a confederation must be one of equals. The weakest must come to the conference table with the same confidence as do we, protected as we are by our moral, economic, and military strength. That table, though scarred by many past frustrations, cannot be abandoned for the certainty agony of disarmament of the battlefield. Disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative.
So, I think President Eisenhower has an extraordinary message. Of course, this farewell address is most famously remembered for the expression, the military-industrial complex. Actually, the original version of the speech was coined, the term was military-industrial congressional complex, but he was convinced to drop that out for fear of alienating congressional allies. But what he's saying is what perhaps some of you suspect, and we'll talk about later in the course. This could have waited until later in the course, but I think it's appropriate. Remember, this is former General Eisenhower, commanding general, supreme Allied commander of the forces of World War II, telling the American people that there is this ominous development in American politics, this conjoining of influence and power, constituted by an enormous military establishment and an enormous, vast military defense armaments industry, Lockheed Martin and Traco Aerospace and all these guys. And their very close set of relationships, as we'll see in another clip, sometimes called an iron triangle if you've studied any of that sort of stuff, where you got these very strong, long-term, lifelong, sometimes, relationships between bureaucrats in the executive branch that deal with defense issues, with very long-term and very close relationships with executives of the interest groups representing, or the lobbyists representing the vast armaments industry that he's talking about, having the capacity to determine not just the military implements that we acquire, but the strategies that they inform, and therefore the policies that we pursue. So he's making a remarkably disconcerting prediction or observation about an emergent property of American politics that he is clear in suggesting is undermining the democratic processes of foreign policy making by putting our foreign policy making and the spending decisions that are at the center of that into the hands of these representatives of the military-industrial complex. I think that is what the speech is most remembered for, and I think it's appropriate that that's the case. He also, however, if you noticed, is making some broader comments about what we ought to do and how we ought to exercise the extraordinary hegemonic power that the U.S. has at its disposal, and that if we wish to achieve the world order that we desire, it is not merely enough that we have this extraordinary military and economic capability, but much more importantly, it is how we exercise, how we put into practice that enormous power and capability. And if we do not do so in the interest of a fair and just world order, one at which weaker countries, the weakest countries, are welcome at the table as equals with the powerful, we are doomed to fail in our efforts to create the kind of peaceful world that we say we seek. It's a remarkable farewell address from a man who spent 50 years in service of his country, 42 of them in uniform, and at the end at the very highest level of command authority. So what I'm suggesting here is, yes, I think I have, in the last 48 hours, found plenty of statistical evidence tested in a number of ways. I think my model is pretty clear that we can explain the ever-increasing defense spending throughout the period of the Cold War, irrespective of external events, merely by what was put into motion by the adoption of NSC 68. But President Eisenhower is telling us there's something else to the story, and that other part of the story is that decisions like armaments acquisition, how much we're going to spend and what we're going to spend it on, is no longer necessarily in the hands or in the purview of democratic processes. It is potentially being taken away from us and into the hands of the military-industrial complex. It's quite a disconcerting message, and I think his subsequent message about how we use that power is something that has been lost on some modern presidents like Bush, and perhaps even Obama, in the use of drones, and certainly I think President Trump has very little sense of what it means to be a responsible hegemonic power, trying to create a world order that's both in the interest of the United States and the rest of the world. Okay, so to give you an example of what Eisenhower feared, let's look at the F-35. The F-35 fighter jet, known as a fifth-generation fighter, is in many respects everything that I selected out of Eisenhower's longer speech. The faith, the kind of blind faith in technological solutions to complex problems, no matter what the cost, no matter what problems there may be with this miraculous solution, as he called it. And despite, as we'll see, the very early and very significant problems with the F-35, it still moves forward, despite extraordinary cost overruns, and despite very serious problems that remain with the F-35. So here's a 5-minute clip giving you, I think, a picture of contemporary manifestations of what President Eisenhower warned us about.
The F-35 is the jet that ate the Pentagon. It's devouring the budget, and it's devouring the Pentagon's air capability.
What it looks like now is we're probably going to spend twice as much as we thought on the system. You're talking about $1.5 trillion.
$1.5 trillion for a plane that so far has not worked. At a time when they're cutting the budget for cops and teachers.
It's extraordinary, phenomenally expensive. And it's never been in combat.
The airplane is so complex and horrendously designed that we'll be lucky if we can fly it every other day.
It won't be ready for combat on the current schedule until about 2019, almost 10 years late.
The biggest beneficiary of the F-35 is Lockheed Martin.
War profiteering is a very easy source of money if you don't worry about what's right and wrong.
Lockheed Martin getting $36 billion a year of our tax money, and much of that rolls over into profit.
These people are being paid with our tax dollars because most of the money that these defense contractors bring in are taxpayer dollars through government contracts.
I think a lot of what the contractors do is basically legalize greed. The F-35 was sold as sort of this great bargain for the country.
The whole purpose behind F-35 was to develop a family and lower the total cost.
The idea was we could make the unit cost of this very inexpensive if we got all the services, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, to buy a version of the F-35.
We're very focused on giving the taxpayer and the Department of Defense very good value for a dollar that is spent.
But it's just this Rube Goldberg contraption, where you've got all these complex things that you're trying to do building around the same airframe.
It tries to do all sorts of things, none of them well.
So there was this whole series of things that it could not do. So in that sense, it was probably the worst possible choice in terms of an affordable aircraft. But it's great for Lockheed Martin because they're going to have cost overruns because they're not ready. They don't work yet. And they're going to fix the things later at our expense. But they're already building them in the hundreds.
Right from the start, Lockheed had a terrible program plan to make sure that the money flow would never get interrupted. And that was the idea of concurrent development.
Concurrency is a wonkish term for buying the airplane as you're developing it and purchasing what you think are going to be combat-ready models before you finish the testing.
And by the time you've tested the airplane and realized it's a disaster, you've already bought a huge number of them. You're committed, as we say in the Pentagon, you've gotten pregnant, right? And that's the whole purpose of concurrent development, is to get the public, the taxpayer, the Congress, everybody committed to this flow of money before you know anything about whether the money is going for anything worthwhile.
Lockheed Martin is the #1 defense contractor in terms of spending. Since 1989, Lockheed Martin has made more than $21 million in campaign contributions to Congress.
So Buck McKeon, for example, who heads the Armed Services Committee in the House, gets $750,000 for his campaigns just since 2009.
And then for the defense industry, the lifeblood on Capitol Hill is lobbying.
When big defense contractors pay lobbyists in Washington, it's actually some of the best money they spend. The return on their investment tends to be huge.
They have 1,000 lobbyists or more, about 2 for every member of Congress.
The amount of money that's gone into making sure that this plane kept flying, that the development kept going, there's been so much spent on this in terms of convincing Congress and convincing the American public, too, that this is a wonderful plane.
And of course, they're funding about 1 out of every 10 members of Congress as part of the Joint Strike Fighter Caucus. Members who've got maybe part of an engine built here, tire is built there, and they get behind it because they can say, you know, it's jobs for my district.
The defense manufacturers are selling big time the jobs they say they're creating. What we found there was that the numbers were grotesquely inflated. In other words, they don't just count line worker riveting wings at the Fort Worth plant, they also count the McDonald's off the plant because somebody going home is going to buy a Big Mac. And that, of course, is a job generated by the F-35, they claim. That's an effort to get the hook in with members of Congress, to intimidate them that if they side against the airplane, there's going to be X number of jobs lost.
They'd say, oh my goodness, this is going to cost 1 million jobs. Never mind whether it works or not, you know. We got to keep building it because we got to keep people working.
But the defense budget is a lousy engine for jobs.
You take any dollar of government spending, education, health, or just tax cuts, you get more bang for the buck than you do in defense.
$1 billion it's about 11,000 jobs if you put it into the military. Transportation generates about 17,000 jobs, about 19,000 if you put it into healthcare, even more if you put it into education. Putting all that spending back into the private economy generates more jobs than are generated by military spending.
Contractors are all interested in making sure that their programs have smooth sailing through the Pentagon and through Congress, and a key mechanism to make sure that happens is the revolving door.
People who are in positions of power in the Pentagon can leave their government jobs where they've been in positions of approving contracts, and after a short cooling off period, can then go to work for the very companies whose contracts they approved.
So what this revolving door system does is make sure the F-35 program survives, no matter how screwed up it is.
The F-35, touted as a tremendous boon to American air power, in fact, is a terrible weakening of American air power. Every extra F-35 we buy means American air power has gone downhill. First of all, simply because every one we buy will be essentially useless in combat and a danger to the pilot. Secondly, because of the huge expense.
There's huge overhead. They're not adequately audited.
We don't know where all that money is going because the program hasn't had that kind of audit and desperately needs that kind of audit.
You know, if you or I can't pass an audit, we're in trouble. Pentagon can't pass an audit. We throw them another $700 billion as if nothing's happened.
The most important thing people can do about it is to demand the truth, to write to their congressmen about the horrible waste of money, to vote against congressmen who vote for it, and to demand that the media come up with the truth. Cutting defense is the only way to reform this monster.
People are going to start to understand, if you look carefully at what the Pentagon and the contractors are doing, much of this is not defending us. It's just defending their bottom lines. It's not defending the country.
So what you've seen there, and I'm going to try to wrap this up as quickly as possible. There's another quick slide on the legacy of George Kennan. Let me just first update. The F-35, this joint fighter aircraft, known as a fifth generation. When we get to the section on military instruments of power, we'll talk more about the revolution in military affairs. The F-35 is the quintessential manifestation of what's called the revolution in military affairs. It's an aircraft described as comprised of systems of systems. It's why it's called the fifth generation. It is part of what gives, or is supposed to give, the American military total battlefield awareness. But the problems that they identify, and could have done a slightly better job of identifying the very significant problems with the F-35 that still exist, include what are there's sort of different categories of problems with military hardware that we're acquiring. Category 1 is the worst degree of problem with, say, a new tank, a new whatever. In this case, the F-35. And at the time, I'm sorry, this is 2019. As late as 2018, there were still a dozen Category 1 problems with the F-35, including a number of Category 1A problems which are of such seriousness that they threaten the lives of pilots and the aircraft itself. The other Category 1 problems with the aircraft are mission-threatening, deficiencies or shortcomings. One of the problems, or one of the many problems, is that Congress is very quickly, at the time of this little clip was made, was very quickly approaching the point at which it needed to make final decision about whether to fully acquire, fully pay for, kind of the final installment, if you will, on the F-35 program, which comes to a total price tag of about $1.5 trillion. $1.5 trillion for an aircraft that at that point had 10 years late, never seen combat, and could not fly responsibly. And the schedule established by Lockheed Martin itself indicated that a number of the Category 1 deficiencies would not be resolved by the time that Congress needed to make its FRP, this the full, what's the acronym stand for? The point at which Congress decides, yes, we're going to fully acquire this and put it into full production. A slight update to this: it has now seen combat. It in this film in I think this is made in 2015. The F-15, 10 years behind schedule, had yet to be flown in a combat mission. Well, in April of this year, the F-35 did fly successful combat missions. But many of the problems still persist. Some of these include, for example, cockpit overpressurization, which creates intense pain in the ears and sinuses of the pilots that make it difficult for them to maintain control of the aircraft. Inadequate thrust in high temperature environments, which make the landing, it has a vertical landing and takeoff capability, kind of like a helicopter. But it has been discovered that in high temperature climates or high temperature environments, there is demonstrated possibility of inadequate thrust to allow it to land at a proper pace, and so the probability of what's called a hard landing is very real to the degree at which it could destroy the aircraft itself. In cold weather environments, we have software problems indicating battery failure that have led to mission abortment. So, it's a deeply troubled program, massively expensive, the most expensive military acquisition program in history at $1.5 trillion, despite all of these very serious problems that other problems include problems at hypersonic speeds, which degrade the stealth capacity. One of the central elements of the F-35 is that it's a stealth aircraft. The other central element is that it's a supersonic aircraft, but they've discovered if you fly it at supersonic speeds, it actually degrades its stealth quality, and so you lose one of the central reasons for the F-35. And there's just many of these very, very serious problems that have yet to be fully addressed, including those that put the lives of pilots and the aircraft themselves in danger. This, I think, is exactly what Eisenhower was talking about. That the choices being made about what military instruments we acquire and the missions that they drive are not being made in a transparent democratic process way, but are in the hands of those key elite personalities in the military-industrial congressional complex that have taken foreign policy making out of the democratic arena and put it into the back rooms of Washington, and that's deeply disturbing. And the point they make is that this is not just bad politics, bad democratic politics. It's injurious to the defense interests of the country. That the idea that we're spending $1.5 trillion to improve our air defense capacity is in fact $1.5 trillion spent in the degradation of U.S. air defense capabilities, and that's just beyond ludicrous. Okay, so finally, just a word about where Kennan sits. Just a very short clip by one of the leading authorities, a diplomatic historian, John Lewis Gaddis, who's written the most important biography on Kennan. He knew George very, very well. Through mutual agreement, they waited until Kennan passed away. They both thought it important that it be a posthumous volume so that it would not be influenced by Kennan's views. And here's what John Lewis Gaddis has to say about Kennan's legacy for the contemporary period.
My name is Christian Mehta, and I'm a member of the Carnegie Council. I love the Council because of the opportunity it provides me to be exposed to thinkers and leaders from around the world and to broaden my perspective. But we need your help. To ensure the future of programs such as these, please support the Council's fund drive. Visit carnegiecouncil.org and click Donate/Join. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you to say something about what you think George Kennan's strategic vision means for the post-Cold War era. In other words, are there some aspects, whether it's nuclear war or others, that you think are very particularly germane to the situation since 1991?
A lot of people obviously ask that question, and I have always tried to be very careful in answering, because it's so easy to put words into the mouths of those who are no longer with us and not able to speak for themselves. And I don't want to do that. I think what I can say is that there are certain transferable principles that can be extracted from George Kennan's writings and teachings that can be applied across time. And that's what we try to do at Yale. We teach George Kennan in just the same way that we teach Thucydides or Machiavelli or Clausewitz or Sun Tzu, looking for these transferable principles that are there. And I think there are several that are very important. One, indeed, is this sense that there is a third way, normally, between war on the one hand and total capitulation or appeasement of a dangerous adversary on the other hand. That the third way is to assess the internal contradictions that may exist within an adversary and to give those the time to develop. I think a third principle that was always there in George was what I was calling earlier an ecological sense. And by this I mean everything is related to everything else, so that you cannot talk about the need for containment without assessing what the means of containment are going to be. And then assessing those means, you have to also assess what their limitations may be, what their risks may be. And what quickly developed with George, certainly by 1949, was the fear that the means of containment had become more dangerous than what was being contained, the Soviet Union, the means of containment being nuclear weapons and the reliance on nuclear weapons. And that really informed George's views through most of the Cold War. His alarm about nuclear weapons was greater than his alarm about the Soviet Union. And you can debate whether that was accurate or not. Who knows? I have taken the position that nuclear weapons had stabilizing effects, but I'd be the first to admit that if anything had gone wrong, it would have been a total disaster. George, pessimist that he was always concerned with what might go wrong and was thinking about disaster during this period. So the answer is yes, there are things that I think transfer to the post-Cold War world. But I think we have to think about them in general terms as guiding principles, not in terms of what we should do about Iran tomorrow. And that's what so many people ask me about and wish I could tell them the answer to. And I'm not going to do it because I don't know.
Okay, so the last thing I'll say is this week we're gonna have a chance to read a piece or discuss a piece by Schlesinger, who is writing in the late '60s at a time where, weirdly enough, they thought the Cold War was kind of over or coming to an end, détente and all that stuff, and so they're looking back, and he's kind of a revisionist historian that gives us an explanation for why and how we ended up in this Cold War situation. And it's got a lot to do with, as I say here, the spheres of influence that dominated Soviet thinking as opposed to a different kind of thinking that dominated Western powers, and most importantly the United States, that he's going to call kind of universalism. So we're going to have a different kind of conversation about ideas and kind of, again, kind of different ontological understandings of the post-war era, the post-war world, rather. And it was the clash and discontinuity, or the conflict between those competing ontological visions that unfortunately gave rise to the Cold War, which was, as I'll say at some point, cold really only between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's true, as John Lewis Gaddis boldly asserts, that thanks to nuclear weapons, a point I think is debatable, but thanks to whatever fear, I think, of escalation of a confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States could lead to an exchange of nuclear weapons between the superpowers, and thus bring about nuclear Armageddon, did in fact prevent the U.S. and the USSR from openly confronting each other. So bullets were never fired in anger between Soviet and American soldiers. But it was damn hot everywhere else in the world. So the Cold War, in many respects, is a misnomer. As we'll see, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, quite hot. Many parts of Africa, quite hot. Latin America, quite hot. So these proxy wars, these efforts on the part of the U.S. and the USSR to establish client states in their effort, the Soviet Union's effort to expand global communism, and the U.S. and NATO's effort to prevent that and expand the kind of which is the free world, or the liberal capitalist, or the liberal international world, ended up in this contest that was, cold only in one respect, but bloody hot in many, many others. So, so this week we're going to kind of reconsider the origins of that, and then quickly move into a discussion of post-Cold War foreign policy and where that takes us. Okay. All right. So thanks very much. This is a 3-hour and 14-minute presentation, so a little longer than the class would have been. But I hope you've gotten what I wanted you to get out of this. It's yours to view at your leisure, but I would really, really like it if you can get this done by Monday. I know I'm getting it to you later than I had hoped, but as I say, that kind of gathering the data and doing the statistical tests that I wanted to do to finally kind of affirm propositions I've been making for years about the impact of NSC 68 on long-term military spending, I think was long overdue. So, okay, thanks everybody. I again, sorry about having to miss Monday. It was a pretty crappy day for me, but things are looking up. So, thanks very much, and I will see you very, very soon. Cheers.